Ever since the invention of flying, pilots have been instructed to preserve in some small corner of their aviator's toolbox the concept that maybe, just maybe, something will cause them to land at some point in the future in a manner and at a location not of their choosing. U.S. Airways. It's safe to say that Captain Chesley Sullenberger's amazing forced landing of his Airbus A320 in the Hudson River is the most well-known forced landing in history. However, from the dawn of flight, pilots have been instructed to always harbor the hope that one day, maybe, just maybe, circumstances may force them to land in a manner and location that they do not like. Even fixed-wing pilots perform it, but without a real runway. It's more of an emergency interruptus drill that is never completed. Auto-rotations to the ground are a thrilling technique helicopter pilots practice. The best airplane emergency landings in history, big and little, brave and embarrassed, clever and just plain lucky, are listed below by Aviation History. This is the part 2 of the 3 incredible emergency plane landings. Carry-on Ansons. The Avro Anson, a twin-engine British Commonwealth trainer that was about the size of a twin beach, was widespread during World War II, although it was far from common enough for 2 identical Ansons to collide over New South Wales, Australia, on September 29, 1940. They not only collided, but they did so softly enough and at the same altitude and in the same direction that they produced a massive, 4-engine biplane that became known in Oz as the piggyback Ansons for all time. Leading aircraftman Leonard Fuller of the Royal Australian Air Force was steadily descending in his Anson Mk. I to cruise at a lower altitude when he crashed with LAC Jack Hewson's Mk. I, who had been flying level and unnoticed immediately beneath him. The awkward retractable landing gear on Ansons, which required a mind-numbing 140 rotations to rise and another 140 to extend for landing, made mating easier. Therefore, Anson pilots like Fuller frequently chose to leave the gear down and pay the 30 miles per hour speed fine if they weren't in a rush. As a result of Fuller's wheels resting on Hewson's wings, their aircraft effectively straddled one another. Hewson crawled out of the broken cockpit side window and parachuted free. Hewson was surprised but survival-minded. He firewalled his 2 throttles and locked the yoke for level flight with his seatbelt. While Hewson had left behind 2 roaring, overboosted engines along with Fuller's still-running right engine, the latter discovered that he could actually fly the tandem because all of his flight controls were intact and functional. Additionally, the 2 engines were sufficient to keep the pair in the air. The Anson's engines seized one after another as they dropped through 500 feet toward what Fuller believed would be a controlled crash due to the strain of a power setting that was only intended to be sustained for a short time during takeoff. The Anson pair quickly descended, but as Fuller neared a farm field, he too blocked his own right throttle and flared in ground effect, touching down so softly that the sole damage to the aircraft came from the airborne collision. Yep, Hewson had also left his landing gear down for the flight. Hewson's aircraft was written off, while Fuller's was quickly fixed and continued to fly for the RAAF for an additional 7 years. The show must go on. Flight RAF. On the evening of November 3, 1943, Lieutenant William Reed was the sole pilot of an Avro Lancaster carrying a cargo of bombs to Dusseldorf. Reed was injured in the shoulders and hands, and had pieces of jagged perspex rake across his head when a Messerschmitt Me-110G night fighter fired a burst through his windscreen when he was only halfway to the target and just past the Dutch shore. Additionally, the assailants had destroyed the elevator trim and taken the Lanx compasses. A weaker guy would have turned around and gone home, but Reed persisted. Lancasters were single-pilot aircraft without dual controls, in contrast to American heavy bombers. The co-pilot seat, which could be folded to allow access to the bombardier's compartment, was occupied by the flight engineer. Soon after, a Focke-Wulf FW-190 Wildsow night fighter discovered them and caused more harm, killing the navigator, critically injuring the radio operator, and destroying the oxygen system of the aircraft. Reed was struck once more, but the flight engineer was still able to deliver Reed a portable O2 bottle despite having a bullet go through one arm. Reed was able to dead-reckon to Dusseldorf with such accuracy when they were still nearly an hour away from the destination that the automatic strike camera later confirmed their bombs had hit the intended target. Reed had remained silent over the intercom, so the only person who knew how severely hurt the pilot was the engineer. Reed, who had lost a lot of blood, headed out for home using the North Star and the Moon. The oxygen bottle was empty, and a 215 miles per hour blast of brisk November air engulfed him through the broken windscreen. Through the usual flak barrages along the Dutch coast and across the North Sea to the flatlands of Norfolk, the flight engineer managed to keep the semi-controllable Lank en route. With the Yusof base at Shipdham in view, a resolute Reed was determined to make the night landing between two rows of runway lights that were just barely visible through ground fog. Blood from his recently opened head wounds were obstructing his eyesight. Despite the one main gear's broken legs giving way, the Avro came to rest hard but safely. Bill Reed received the Victoria Cross in recognition of his airmanship, bravery, and dedication to duty. Like, subscribe, and share this content with some friend. Help us to spread free valuable knowledge. Through the rainforest. The crew of Brazilian airline Varex Flight 254 on September 3, 1989, became heroes for safely rescuing themselves and their passengers from catastrophic situations of their own creating, if only for a moment. The Boeing 737 crew had a long day ahead of them. When they arrived in Maraba, approximately 200 miles south of their intended destination, Belém, the aircraft had taken out from São Paulo in the morning and had traveled most of the length of Brazil in a northerly direction with half a dozen stops along the way. They got ready to take off again around 5:30 p.m. The printed flight plan revealed to Captain Cesar Garces that the path to Belém was 0270. A heading of 27.0 degrees, or north-northeast, was indicated. However, Garces misread it as 270 degrees, meaning due west and directly into the northern Mato Grosso woods, one of the least populated regions of Brazil. It was comparable to a pilot who was supposed to be flying from San Francisco to Seattle but instead pointed his aircraft at Hawaii. The two crew members were out of fuel by the time they recognized their mistake because Garces' co-pilot, Nilson de Souza Zil, had blindly followed the captain's instructions. Garces radioed air traffic control that he would be landing in the rainforest at 8:40, more than 2 hours after they were scheduled to arrive in Belém, even though he still didn't know where. Since there was no way to dump the fuel and he wanted to land with the least amount of risk of fire, Garces continued to fly until the Boeing's fuel tanks were empty. With hydraulic power rapidly dwindling, Garces was unable to extend more than a limited amount of flaps when the engines eventually came to a stop, and he could hardly see the horizon through the glare of distant fires. He managed to flare the 737 into the tops of trees in a rainforest that were as tall as an 18-story building despite having no cockpit lighting and few functional instruments. The Boeing's wings tore off as it touched down, and it skidded to a halt in an instant. There were 13 fatalities but 41 survivors. Before it became clear why they had needed the talent, the crewmen were briefly praised for it. Did you already know any of those? Please make the internet cleaner and full of good knowledge, share it with a friend, and let us know what you think in the comments.